Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 1, from the fall of Rome to the emergence of Christendom. Now, this lecture is kind of where we start in this course. The last week we had a couple lectures on kind of the context and approach to the High and Later Middle Ages and such. And this is a monster lecture. Kind of sit back and relax. We'll take it slowly, or well, not all that slowly. It's probably will be the longest lecture of the entire course. I'll make it up. Don't worry in terms of time, because it's really getting or squeezing 3/4 of an entire course into one lecture. But there are important concepts and terms that you'll also see on midterm 1 um, that are essential to understand for understanding where the chronological frame of the course begins approximately in the year 1000. Now, 2, with the so-called fall of Rome, and I'll be arguing later in this lecture that Rome never really fell, depending on what we mean by that, but I'll get there when we get there. We have to talk something more about Rome anyway. Um, and the first kind of big topic there is what I call the myth of Rome. Now, why is that important? It's very important as I see things and present things. I should first say that the myth of Rome is not the same as myths of Rome. Romulus and Remus, the mythological founders of Rome, um, that's a myth of Rome, but it's a Roman myth. So the myth of Rome is something distinct from Roman myths. It is, as we'll see, the creation of Rome as an eternal empire. And why that is so important is because that becomes transformed into what I refer to as the myth of Christendom. Excuse me. Now, I've addressed myth in the document History, Religion, Myth, and Theology, or whatever it was that was assigned for last week. This week, you have chapters 4 through 6 in my textbook, The Myth of the West, is assigned, and then for next week, chapters 7 through 9, and those are going to be very important too. And this lecture will kind of cover some of next week's readings, but also this week's. And so it gets into important material, essential material for understanding what this course is about, and also why we talk about the High and Late Middle Ages as distinct from the early medieval period, as distinct from late antiquity. And I talked about periodization last lecture, the problems that are involved in that concept, and we usually take these periods as concrete things, but they weren't. They're very artificial, but we'll see how this all kind of flows together, especially with the concept of the Roman Empire remained. Now, again, I'll address that when we get there. So we're going to first start with the myth of Rome, which then brings us back to the origins and foundation of Rome. Before we talk then very briefly go through very quickly about kind of the history of the empire and the emergence of first of all the republic and then the empire. I'll address that problem too when we get there, because that concept of this world empire, this eternal world empire, was established in Rome, became the Christian empire, Christendom, and in some ways is still with us today. But again, I'll get there when I get there. So that's kind of the context. Now, I'll see how things go. As I said, I never really know what's going to come out of my mouth until I start speaking on camera. I may end up, on purpose, breaking this up into 2 parts. And so if I do, I'll let you know, obviously. And hopefully I won't screw things up and force myself to do so by clicking the wrong thing, and so it will end up being in 3 or 4 parts that I hope to avoid. But anyways, please bear with me, and we'll get through this. Some things I'll be going through very quickly because also they're in the readings. Other things I want to emphasize, and so we'll kind of hopefully discuss this development from, well, 3,000 years almost, because Rome traditionally was founded in 753 BCE from the foundation of the city. That's how they dated their own calendar, from the foundation of the city, which we determined to be 753 BCE. And it goes up through getting ready for Charlemagne in the late 8th century CE. So that's kind of the scope that we're talking about. So, that being said, we're going to get going now, and pay attention, take notes, and we'll get through this, believe me. But this sets a foundational understanding for the rest of the course. Maybe not everything that I will be talking about, but especially the terms in part one of midterm one are going to be essential. And those I'll be addressing here, and then for the essay, others as well. So it's not something that you can just sit back and passively listen to and let go over you and not worry about. It's there, but the readings is there too. If this goes too quickly, of course, you can all stop it and re-listen to parts of it. But you can also then do the reading as you're supposed to be doing, and we'll go from there. All right. That being said, let's then turn to the first slide here, the myth of Rome. Now, I've already addressed the issue of the myth of Rome, the distinction between the myth of Rome and Roman myths. The myth of Rome is my term. I'm not sure I've seen it other places. And it refers again to this concept of an eternal empire. But how did it get there? Now, Rome, the problem is with Rome, so many other things, it didn't always start out to be what it became. I mean, it developed and everything else. And it was a fusion. Rome was founded by the joining together of two groups, two Italian tribes, the Etruscans and the Latins. And they got together and they founded the city of Rome, again, supposedly in 753 BCE by Romulus. And they were a king. It was ruled by a king. I mean, it was a city-state, relatively small in central Italy. And we can't really talk about ethnicities of it. I mean, that gets to be a whole other issue, which I wasn't going to go into. But it's really became certainly a melting pot. And the original, quote unquote, original Romans were already a fusion of the Etruscans and the Latins, two distinct Latin ethnographic tribes. But they were ruled by a king until Tarquin, the Proud, as he was called, was seen as a tyrant. And a number of leading citizens here and throughout all of this course basically referred to free property owning males who were also warriors. And the earliest warriors of Rome, the Roman legions, were the citizenry itself, the men who comprised the city, the farmers, basically, because agriculture was the basis of wealth. But they thought Tarquin, as king, was a tyrant. And they rose up, including a man by the name of Brutus, which we'll come back to. And they assassinated, or they killed Tarquin. And in 509 BCE, they established a republic. Now, a republic is something that is a representative government. And we talk about there was laws of 12 tables, set the Roman laws, about the Constitution, but the Constitution of the Republic was more an unwritten constitution than explicitly related to the 12 tables. So it's not necessarily the same as our Constitution, but it's how it was structured and with the laws that were involved. And Romans became very known as people of law. Now, the slide here, the Roman Constitution, as up there is the chief executive officer, so to speak, or the executive, consisted of two consuls. Now, if you look at this slide, the Roman Constitution, you can see the parallels with the U.S. form of government. And that's too because the founders of our government back in the day when they were putting it together. Knew Roman history very well. They studied Roman history, and later on they studied John Locke as well. So they had a very good understanding of quote unquote Western political and institutional history and development. They had two consuls, a senate, and then later assemblies, an assembly. Those were the legislative bodies. And so we have basically the executive branch, or the two consuls. Then we have the legislative branch, the Senate, and the assemblies. And then a number of offices, quaestor, praetor, censor, tribune, aedile. These are things like in charge of taxes, in charge of the census, who's a citizen, who isn't, in charge of the people, the common people out there, in charge of of criminals, etc. So they had all of these different representative offices. The assemblies were broader, but the Senate was where the real power was. So if you look at this as a mixed constitution that Aristotle had talked about, he said that there was three good types of government and three corrupt forms of government. And the three good forms of government for Aristotle were monarchy, which he defined as the rule of one for the good of all, aristocracy, which was the rule of a few for the good of all, and then polity, which is rule of the many for the good of all. And the corrupt forms were tyranny, which was the rule of one for the ruler's own good, oligarchy, a rule of the few for their own good, and then democracy, or mob rule, which was the corruption of polity. And here we see we have two consuls. So we don't have that monarchical form from Aristotle, except that is the executive branch, so to speak. And they just had two people in that position. And that's going to be very important. The Senate was the aristocratic version, and the assemblies then was the more polity, or what we call democratic institutions. Now, also down there, after the quaestor, praetor, censor, tribune, aedile, those are all individual offices, were the priests, the pontifices, and the pontifex maximus, chief priest. The pontifex maximus just means chief priest. And a pontifex is priest, Maximus is the greatest, most important. That becomes an office that is so important for later on, because at this time and throughout this course, as we will see, this concept that we have today, here in this country anyway, of the so-called separation of church and state did not exist in any way, shape, or form. And now, obviously, this is clearly before the rise of Christianity. I'll be talking about the rise of Christianity shortly. But it is essential to understand that for the Romans, religion was part of being a good citizen, being religious. And that if you were a good citizen, you were by definition religious, which meant following the Roman religions and religious traditions. And the priests were in charge of it, and the chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, was in charge of all the priests. It was very open, Roman religion. You could have your own devotional cults to whatever gods you wanted to, and basically the Roman pantheon, the Roman gods, were the just Latinized versions of the Greek gods, by and large. But you still had to follow kind of what the state said, and that is going to come back again and again, we'll see. So as long as you did what you're supposed to do according to the state, then you could have your own religious beliefs and private devotions and everything else. Pontifex Maximus is still with us. We still have a Pontifex Maximus, namely the Pope, but we'll get there when we get there, so to speak. Cicero, famous Roman orator and statesman and philosopher and lawyer, defined religion as a civic virtue. And we'll see more of this shortly. The concept of being pious, If you were religious in the sense that you should be, then you were considered to be pious or pious in Latin. Now, my sense is that in English, the term pious and piety is kind of gooey. And I certainly don't mean to offend anybody, but it's more something that we would call other people, oh, they're so pious, and not so much things that we say, oh, I'm pious. Um, that's kind of what I'm getting at. But for the Roman, being pious or pious was the idea of what you should be if you're going to adequately be religious for being a good citizen. That was what it was all about. And being pious meant you showed reverence and fulfilled your obligations to the gods, to your family, and to the state, Rome. And we'll see shortly again that Virgil created a character, Aeneas, who became the model of piety. He was referred to by Virgil as Pius Aeneas. We'll see how important that became for Rome, for the myth of Rome, and later on thereafter in the transformation of the myth of Rome into the myth of Christendom, which is what we're really talking about. So that concept we need to realize. And get beyond this concept of church and state being just separate. All we have to do is ask ourselves, okay, church and state may be separate, but are politics and religion separate? And I think today we'd have to say absolutely not. That's kind of what is getting at this concept of Roman civic religion, as Augustine called it. Being a pious, good Roman meant to be religious, devotion to the gods, to the state, and to your family. And that was all the cult, and that was what cultus in Latin means, is worship. We don't really talk about going to a Christian cult unless we were talking about something really kind of weird. But that is the origins of it. It just meant worship. And cultus in Latin is also the root of our word culture. So somehow culture and religion are closely related etymologically, as is agriculture. Because what is agriculture? It is basically the worship of the fields, the ground, the earth. Ager is field in Latin. And so it is this close association between the agricultural farming wealth that was needed for survival in these early city-states with the religious views and the gods and the state itself that all function together, that if you're going to be a good citizen, you better darn well be religious. Because that's what makes one a good citizen, fulfilling your obligations to the gods, to the state, and to your family. That is very essential and very important as we go through this more and more, because that definition too would be repeated again and again later on. Now, that kind of is going to take me through to the origins of the Republic. And then here, the next slide is from Empire to Empire, the fall of the Republic. And the first point there is, what is empire? And this too is going to be really important, because empire, as we use the term, is distinct from how the Romans used it. Imperium in Latin meant command. So if you had imperium, you had command over your troops. Every Roman general had imperium over his troops. The government, the Senate, the government, had imperium over all the generals. The consuls had imperium, basically, together with the Senate, over the entire government. Now, there's a big distinction to make between empire, as we use the term, as a form of government, and empire as the extent of control. That second definition, empire as extent of control, or another word that I think is very helpful here, is hegemonic control. I don't know if you know the word hegemony. If you don't, you look it up. It means basically control over. And so if you have hegemonic control, you have command over. That is the kind of the form of government of empire, which is distinct from having control over a territory geographically that we refer to as empire. So I often say it's kind of fun that Rome was an empire long before it became an empire because it exerted control over vast territories before it ever became an empire in terms of an emperor and imperial rule, the rule of one commander. Um, and so that is a distinction we need to keep in mind. So the Republic was an empire pretty early on, even though it was still the Republic. So we talk about the fall of the Republic. We're talking about the fall of this form of government based on the Constitution that I just went through briefly, and how it transformed into a different form of governing. Now, the fall of the Republic, too, was led by or precipitated by a general by the name of Julius Caesar. Caesar was his family name, Julius, so it's Julius Caesar. Um, and he had command of his troops. He was a general. He had imperium over his troops. Now, the problem was this. The Roman Constitution provided for, and here I'm talking about the Roman Constitution, not just the structures, but also the 12 tables, provided for in times of chaos and times of problems, significant problems and crises, someone could proclaim themselves dictator to restore order. Now, dictator is a word in Latin that just means one who speaks. You had two consuls, right? They had to agree. That was the idea, too. They had to agree on something. And so if there was debate, they couldn't say this is going to be the policy because we disagree. When you have a dictator, that dictator is one who speaks, who says, this is the way it's going to be, and that's the way it is. In 88 BCE, the general, who had imperium over his troops, Sulla, marched on Rome with his troops because chaos was erupting, restored order, and then, as the Constitution advocated, returned power to the Senate. Now, if you can think about this too, in terms of the United States government, and I'm not going to go into the theoretical debate of presidential powers, but it's always been in times of war, whatever that might mean or however that might be defined, the president has extended powers that in peace times the president does not usually have. Makes sense. Just think what it would be like if Congress had to pass every decision about military operations. It'd be impossible. It'd be not feasible, and we would never get anything done militarily, even if we were being attacked. That we all maybe might agree. So yes, this is something we have to do, but then what do we do? And if we had to get every decision through Congress to be signed by the president, oh my God. So that dictatorial power in the Roman Constitution was a necessary entity of the Constitution itself, as long as it stayed within the confines of restoring order and returning power to the Senate, which Sulla did in 88 BCE, but then Julius Caesar did not. That was the problem. In 49, Julius Caesar took his troops, led them past the Rubicon, crossed the Rubicon. The die was cast as a point of no return. We still use that phrase, to cross the Rubicon, with Caesar, because it's like, okay, if I do bring my troops over to because he was in the north, Transalpine Gaul, if he brings his troops over further south, over the crossing the Rubicon, he couldn't turn back. And he didn't, and that was in 49 BCE, and he continued to roam, restored order, and remained as dictator, and proclaimed himself dictator for life. The Senate thought this was horrible. At least some members of the Senate thought it was horrible. So they got together and they assassinated just like the senators did. Tarquin before the Senate, but the citizens got together and assassinated Tarquin back in 509 BCE to establish the Republic, because Julius Caesar, by proclaiming himself dictator for life, was seen as a threat to the Constitution. Proclaiming himself dictator in a time of need is not that big of a deal. If it's really seen that it's needed, okay, great, come back, restore order like Sulla did, and then return power to the Senate. Caesar refused to return power to the Senate, which undermined the very Roman constitution itself in terms of how Rome would be governed. And by this time already, Rome controlled all of the Italian peninsula and North Africa and Carthage. And of course, Caesar extended the rule north